Sup everyone? If you like cross-promotion, you're in luck, because in today's edition of Idle Chit Chat, I will be discussing the non-Idle Chit Chat video that I put on this channel right before this video about the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens. It's an historic music video montage thing. It's 4 minutes long, and it took a really long time to make. I actually came very close to abandoning it on multiple occasions because of how time-consuming it was. But I was able to finish it by stretching out the process and making a little bit of progress on it each day. It took a couple months to finally finish, to sift through many news clips and documentaries about this one subject. But it's something I'm pretty proud of. I think it's one of the best videos I've ever made, honestly. In part because there aren't many videos like it, as far as I know. It's like a montage music video in which all the clips are fit tightly to music, but instead of lyrics, what you're hearing is the audio from archival news snippets. So it's like an educational and nerdy music video, which makes it weird. The way this came about was the COVID-19 pandemic hit America in 2020, and when it did, there were a bunch of people who refused to take the threat seriously. There were all these people who were like, "This is all a hoax by the media. This virus isn't any big deal. It's like the flu. It's all a conspiracy by Bill Gates to insert microchips into our bloodstream." Like, people actually thought that. A lot of people, like half the country, really believed that. And living through that incredibly stupid blot in history made me think of other historical parallels to this science denialism. And one of the things that came to mind was Mount St. Helens. When Mount St. Helens was getting ready to erupt in 1980 in Washington state, there were a bunch of people who were mad that they were being forced to evacuate the area. There were people then, like there were in 2020, who were like, "Oh, this is all a bunch of nonsense. You're not helping me. All you're doing is hurting my ability to manage a business by keeping me away from my home." But of those people who kvetched about what an injustice this was, they all left. Pretty much all the people who lived right in front of Mount St. Helens took off. Except for this one guy, this one 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman, no relation to Harry S. Truman, who had been managing this lodge next to a lake next to the mountain for 50 years. And he refused to go. And people begged him to go. His family begged him to leave, but he wouldn't. And because of his defiance, in the weeks and months leading up to the eruption, he became this counterculture folk hero. He became this rebellious symbol to people because he was saying no to the authorities. And it made him nationally famous. He was getting like daily interview requests from reporters. He became so well known that when they made a movie about Mount St. Helens' eruption the next year, Truman was the main character. And he was played by Art Carney, who was this very famous actor. So Truman morphed into this lovable folk hero. And naturally, what eventually happens is Mount St. Helens finally erupts. And it's the biggest volcanic eruption in the history of America. It's the biggest landslide in the history of America. A cubic mile of the mountain just comes barreling off of it. And because Truman refused to leave, he and his lodge were immediately vaporized. And not only did he die from this, his lodge was obliterated to the point that they never found a trace of him. So, the tale of Harry R. Truman is a cautionary one. Except, it kind of isn't. Because even factoring in how it ended for him, there was something very human about him refusing to leave in the face of impending danger. As illogical as it was something people related to. And so his legend continued. And me personally, looking back at him decades later, I found him fascinating. And it helps that he was a very quotable person. Everything he said was very salty and cantankerous and colorful. He was constantly swearing in front of reporters. And I think it's almost impossible to watch an old clip of him without finding him kind of charming. And so I was inspired to make a video about him. And it was while I was thinking about making a video about him that I was watching a lot of Shmo-Yoho videos, which are these YouTube videos by the Gregory brothers where they take sound bites from people and turn them into songs. And I thought, I can't do that. I don't know how to do that. But it would be cool, just as an experiment, to make a musical montage that summarizes an historical event in 3 minutes, and to have everything said in those 3 minutes be told through archival news clips. It was a unique idea to me, and so I decided that I should try to do this, and that I should make that video about Harry R. Truman, because to me, he was the perfect subject matter for this. And I got to work, and it was a lot of work, but it turned out pretty damn well, and I'm proud of it. One other thing I should say about that video is that it is an homage to an old Adult Swim action bump. Back in 2004, Adult Swim would air these bumpers coming out of commercial breaks for anime in which they were showing these images of Japan set to instrumental music, and one of those bumps was of Mount Fujiyama, and it was set to this really cool music from a group called Psyche Origami. And by 2021, I had already gotten permission years ago to use Psyche Origami's music in my videos, and so I figured, well, hey, since I already know that this track fits well with images of mountains, I might as well use it in the background of this video. And then when I do that, I'll acknowledge the inspiration in a later video so that you know that it's an homage and that it's not me being incredibly lazy or derivative or whatever. But yeah, there you go. This is an aside, but I practically grew up on Adult Swim when I was younger, and the tracks they played during their bumpers had a huge influence on me artistically. I absolutely attribute my love of instrumentals and electronic music and lo-fi music to the stuff that they were featuring in their bumps. In fact, a lot of the music that I use as outros in these videos, my benchmark for them sometimes literally is, would this work as the music in an old school Adult Swim bump? So, yeah. Bit of a detour from the point of this video, but hey, credit where credit is due. My videos wouldn't look the way they did if not for me growing up on Adult Swim, so figured I'd give a shout out. Now, the thing with making that Truman video is that because of how short it is, there were a few clips that I compiled about Truman and of Mount St. Helens that I found really interesting, but that I wasn't able to fit in the video. There's only so much information compressing you can do in 3 minutes. So I had to leave some stuff out, unfortunately. But because I still have those clips on my computer, and since I do think they're worth discussing, especially since it's fun to just talk about Harry R. Truman in general, I thought it'd be cool to share those clips with you guys before I rid them from my computer. And so, let's do that. For the rest of this video, let's take a look at the clips that I unearthed about Harry R. Truman and Mount St. Helens that I believe add more context to who Truman was and what happened to him, but that for one reason or another didn't quite make it into my musical montage video thing about him. So, let's start with an old clip of Truman from 1 year before the volcano got him.
There's no doubt the Harry R. Truman Resort has seen better days. Those were the days Harry used to hide his profits under a log in the woods. He says he quit that a while back. Last time it snowed, the log and his money were lost forever.
The great thing with Truman is that he was like a walking, talking folktale. It's easy to imagine campers telling stories of the old man who lived up in the mountains all by himself, and he was so eccentric that he buried his fortune under a log outside, and they say that to this day, no one has ever found his missing treasure. And unfortunately, no one ever will, because it was lost to time long before the entire forest was wiped away in the blink of an eye. But yeah, Truman was totally the type of person that you could imagine there being crazy rumors about. Kids who grew up in that region must have seen this guy as a kooky, larger-than-life figure. In part because he kind of was. Next, here's a clip that just barely missed. It's a highlight of Truman refusing to leave the vicinity despite the wishes of his juniors.
School children wrote Truman asking him to leave the danger area. Sheriff's departments offered transportation, but Truman refused. As late as Saturday, May 17th, Truman confirmed he would not leave the serenity and beauty of his Spirit Lake home. Harry saluted would-be rescuers with a false sense of security.
One thing I learned from all my researching on this was that in 1980, Mount St. Helens had been dormant for so long that a lot of Washington's residents didn't know that it was an active volcano. In fact, some people didn't even know that it was a volcano. Some people thought it was just a regular mountain. But a couple months out from the big eruption, Mount St. Helens started to produce these tremors. It was producing earthquakes all of a sudden, and they kept intensifying, and smoke started to billow out from its peak. And geologists showed up on the scene, and they went, "This thing is going to blow. We don't know exactly when it's going to happen, but it's going to be soon, and it's going to be bad, and people need to get away from this thing while they still can." But Truman, he had spent his entire life in the shadow of that mountain, and nothing had ever happened to him. And so he just thought he was fine. He thought he was safe. He turned down innumerable chances to evacuate as late as the day before it happened. In this next clip, you'll see that he even told people that he had an escape plan, that even if something bad happened, he was going to be fine.
We also we were asking about, well, aren't you concerned about the mountain coming down? He had no concerns. I mean, he was a cantankerous guy for sure. And he said there was a cave. He had a cave on the other side of the lake. They had supplies in there, and he had a speedboat. And if it started to erupt, he was going to jump in the speedboat, go across the lake. And he said he was good for a month there with the supplies. Obviously, he didn't make it, but it was an interesting experience.
He really thought that there was no scenario where this could do him in, even if it happened, which he didn't think it would. He was telling people that he was going to take a boat and hide in a cave if something happened. When in reality, when the landslide hit, he died immediately. And this is the part of the Harry R. Truman story that has me ambivalent. Because if he had accepted that he could die and he had decided to stay home anyway, that would be one thing. That would be him reconciling with the danger. But instead, he never believed the danger. He told people he would go down with the ship, but he never accepted that that could really happen. And so when he refused to leave, he was making his decision on a false premise. And that is the part of his story that is uncomfortable. When I closed out the video montage of him that I made, I ended it on a clip of him saying that the press had exaggerated the whole thing. And the reason I ended that video on that was so that I could highlight that that part of his decision-making was wrong and is a part of his narrative that complicates things. Like, we'll never know if he actually would have stayed behind if he truly believed that he would die from this. Maybe he would have. But the fact that we don't know definitively takes a bit of the sacrifice out of his story, and instead, it adds a little hubris. And so, even after completing this passion project about him, I am genuinely conflicted on whether Harry R. Truman's story is a tragedy or something that should be celebrated. I'm honestly not sure. Where do you fall, viewer? What do you think? Because for me, his story lands somewhere between laudatory and tragic. Like, I can see both sides, because even though you could reasonably say that he cut his life short with his ignorance, he was still 83 years old, and he was a widower, and he didn't want to leave the home that he had spent his entire adult life in with his wife. And so, it doesn't feel right to criticize him. I think pretty much everyone can understand where he was coming from. In fact, here's a clip that goes in the other direction from the one I just showed you. This clip goes in the "this was a cool story" column.
Rosen says as the volcano awakened in the spring of 1980, her Uncle Truman also seemed to come to life. He'd been extremely lonely, living in the lodge with his 16 cats. The volcano changed that. While it did bring the danger of an eruption, it also brought hundreds of visitors, and Truman, being the character he was, refusing to leave, became the center of attention for reporters and scientists.
So the volcano reinvigorated Harry R. Truman. It gave him his life back, in a way. It gave him a purpose and excitement and a chance to be around all these people again. And the volcano wound up costing him his life, but I know there are a lot of people who would argue that that extra quality of life that he enjoyed in the months leading up to the eruption more than made up for the fact that it later killed him. I think some people would argue that he had already lived a full life, and that him dying wasn't a tragedy, and that this was actually the most fitting, badass way for him to go out. And I totally get that. I totally understand where those people are coming from. But I can't quite get on board with that. I think the thing that gives me pause is that people wouldn't say that about him if he hadn't died in this incredibly specific manner. Like, if at the exact time that he would have died from the volcano, if instead of dying that way, Truman was instead mauled to death by a grizzly bear that tore open his throat and ripped his guts out, if that's how he died instead, I don't think people would look at his death and find it cool. I think people would look at it and find it sad and horrifying, even if he was 83 years old. But because he died in this way that was instantaneous, where it happened so quickly that he never felt pain, and because the way he died is this weird historical oddity, it gave him this cult legendary status that he wouldn't have gotten otherwise. He wouldn't be a legend if he had fled. When people think of Mount St. Helens' eruption, Harry R. Truman is the first person and usually the only person they equate it with. And that's definitely something, even if he wasn't as prepared to go in that moment as some people might think. Also in that clip, it was mentioned that Truman had 16 cats with him at his lodge. That was a detail that I wanted to work into that montage if I could have, but I never found a way to do it without it feeling forced. The reason I wanted to mention it was to highlight that it wasn't just him that died when the landslide hit him. Unfortunately, all of his pets died too, and that probably doesn't change the way you feel about his decision if you think it's cool, but it's not nothing. Anyway, next clip.
Maybe it's a crazy idea. If I had anything to do with that goddamn mountain, I'd stopped it the other day. I'd have flew over there, that bomber, and I'd dropped a bomb right in the middle of that big crater. That'd have been the end of it. When that bomb exploded down the base of that, it blew that thing right out of there. Hair, guts, and feathers and all, it went up. Then the snow and ice had come in the next 10 years solid in there, and they would have no more trouble.
That clip is hilarious to me because Truman was giving all these interviews where he was saying how important the mountain was to him and how the mountain was like an extension of his body and how you can't take Truman away from the mountain any more than you can take the mountain away from Truman. And yet, when he was asked what they should do about the tremors that were coming from the mountain, he immediately went, they should just bomb the mountain. If it was up to me, I'd drop a bomb in the volcano. Why not? The science will work itself out somehow. Who cares? Next.
I have no intentions of leaving, and I never have had any intentions, and never that I knew of the last 4 or 5 days.
Harry had always said he wanted to die a violent and fiery death, and the mountain he loved apparently granted him his wish, although his body has never been recovered.
Okay, now that clip is awesome. A reporter saying, well, he always wanted to die a fiery and violent death. That's great, and I wish I could have used that snippet in my video, but I couldn't because the guy saying it didn't say it definitively. Like, he left it open that maybe Truman survived because they never found his body, but that was unnecessary hedging. There was no way Truman could have lived through that. So I sadly couldn't use that clip, even though the fact that Truman said he wanted to die violently is a wonderful detail that somehow makes his violent death more amusing. In the montage, there's a wonderful moment where you can see Truman holding up a shirt that said, "Where were you when Mount St. Helens blew?" And it was only a couple weeks before he died from Mount St. Helens blowing up. And so, on top of everything else about Truman's death, it was very ironic in multiple ways. Next clip.
From the amount of debris from the landslide, scientists calculated that 2/3 of a cubic mile of rock slid down the mountain, enough to bury Washington, D.C. under 50 feet of rubble. It was one of the biggest landslides ever recorded in history. It tore a gaping hole in the side of the mountain, almost 2 miles wide and over 2,000 feet deep.
There's a lot of science in that clip that's interesting. The thing that was shocking about Mount St. Helens at the time was that up until then, everyone believed, including scientists and geologists, that volcanoes only erupted upwards, and Mount St. Helens erupted sideways. It erupted laterally in a way that created this giant crater at the top of it. And the best thing about that clip is that it really illustrates how incredibly close Spirit Lake, where Harry Truman was living, was to this mountain. I mean, look at it. It's right there. It's only a couple miles away. When Mount St. Helens erupted, it not only erupted laterally, it erupted directly towards Harry Truman. He got hit with a blast of rock and ash and gas that had the power of several hydrogen bombs behind it, and that was around 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, just in case that didn't do him in, an extra wave of molten liquid consumed the area that would have killed him 1,000 times over yet again. So, as great as it would have been if Truman survived, there was no way. He never had a chance. There's actually another clip I found that diagrams just how screwed he was, and I would have used it in my video, but I didn't because, as you'll see, it uses 3D technology that was a bit rough around the edges.
Back at the mountain, the other half of the landslide had flowed to the northeast and crashed into Spirit Lake, creating a tidal wave. The displaced water scoured the surrounding hillsides and washed the blown-down trees back into the lake.
Computer graphics have made big strides over the years. But yeah, there's no way to look at that without processing that the reason they never found Truman's body was because he didn't have a body after all that. In fact, the landslide was so devastating that it killed everything it came in contact with. It wiped out all the foliage and every creature in the area. It even blocked out the sun in some of the cities that were nearby, because that's how much ash was put into the air. It's pretty remarkable when you think about it that only 57 people died from this. It's a testament to how few people were in the blast zone of the volcano at the time. And the landslide was so catastrophic that Spirit Lake was never the same again, and it took decades for color to even reappear in the region. This next clip is from 10 years after the Mount St. Helens eruption, and you'd think that 10 years would have been enough time for that area to show some new signs of life and to kind of get back to normal again, but no.
Although some life is slowly returning to the volcano's blast zone, most of the eerie landscape here looks just as dusty and gray as the day after the eruption. Spectacular Spirit Lake here, still clogged with millions of dead fir trees. The timber blown into Spirit Lake by the force of the eruption and still bobbing about a decade later.
Spirit Lake was this pristine, gorgeous vacation spot. It was a major tourist attraction. And that eruption changed the topography of the area, and it killed all the trees, like literally every single one of them. And the area just never got back to what it was. I watched a video on what Spirit Lake looked like 40 years later. And even 40 years later, there were still thousands and thousands of dead trees that were just floating on the surface of that lake. Like, that spot in the mountains that Harry Truman refused to leave because of how beautiful it was, it didn't exist anymore. And that's kind of depressing. But maybe not too depressing, as you'll see in this final clip that aired on May 29th, 1980, just 11 days after the eruption of Mount St. Helens.
Because in addition to the eruption on the mountain, there has been another eruption, a volcano mania business boom. There is the Mount St. Helens ashtray.
What you do is you put a cigarette in here, and it smokes at the top.
And of course, there's the handy pocket-sized version of Mount St. Helens.
And by putting a little soda in here and some vinegar, smoke will come up and we have a Mount St. Helens eruption.
So you have your own little volcano at home.
Yeah. And a toy for a kid. A kid can be playing with that for years.
That's a cute little item. And what would a volcano eruption be without volcano t-shirts? And volcano buttons? And the ever-popular volcano frisbee. $2.99, thank you. And for anyone who couldn't experience the volcanic ash fallout firsthand, they're selling vials of real ash.
That clip was never going to make it into the montage because it's too much of a departure from the rest of the mix. But I had to share this anyway because that right there is quintessentially American. You have a tragedy in which 57 people are dead. Billions of dollars in damage have been inflicted. Homes have been ruined. This pristine, cherished ecosystem has been destroyed. And yet there were people who were like, well, it's not sad enough for me to not commemorate that this crazy thing happened. And so people found opportunity in this and relished it. People were like, hooray, I want the Mount St. Helens replica toy that mimics how Harry R. Truman violently died less than 2 weeks ago. You know, it seems kind of ghoulish when you think about the immediacy of how quickly this got commercialized. But really, what is this if not the most American thing ever? What is the American healing process if not people finding a way to exploit someone else's tragedy for money? So, there you have it. Between this and the other video, you now know pretty much everything you'd ever need to know about both the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens and the man who refused to flee from it. So, go forth and use that knowledge wisely. And if nothing else, remember, when scientists tell you to do something, it's generally in your best interest to listen to them.